Okay, we're rolling. Warren, thank you so much for jumping on.
Happy to be here with you, Phil. Thanks.
So I'm here today with Warren Levy and from Frontier Advisors. I will let you do your own introduction because I'm not really great at those. But before that, well, introduction for myself. I'm Phil. I'm a partner at Webisoft. We build custom software, a lot in AI, blockchain, and now ERP as of this year. And our goal with this podcast is to meet interesting people doing interesting things in industries that we serve. And so, Warren, can you take a couple minutes to explain who you are, what you do?
Sure. So I'm Canadian, even though I left Canada at the beginning of my career and started working in the energy sector in Latin America. Initially in Venezuela 30 years ago, and then ended up holding a variety of positions around Latin America. Did 4 years in Asia, and then started my own company, initially based in Argentina, which is an oilfield services company that grew to be in 7 countries, a little over 2,500 employees spread across the region. When I sold that, I then switched over to running exploration and production companies and done that for both private and public sector companies. Most recently, I was running the largest private natural gas company in Mexico, a company called Jaguar, which a little over a year ago we sold. And on selling that and enjoying what was supposed to be a semi-retirement, I decided to restart a business that we've been doing a fair bit of work in the past on marrying Latin American projects with capital. So both advising investment funds looking for projects and occasionally projects looking for capital, and then doing energy policy advisory work as well. So both for corporations and for more provincial, state level governments, we do a fair bit of energy policy work as well.
So, what drew you out of retirement? Because you're not the first one to say, try to retire, and then I guess you found this new project.
Um, I- it was something that I was quite happily enjoying a bit of time with the family, and then realized that I would rapidly get bored. And more than anything, I think solving the problems of how to see development occur in Latin America and see it be responsible. So, good projects, good people that lack capital, or responsible capital that doesn't necessarily know how to navigate their way in Latin America. And started out just advising people, and then, found some projects that I really liked, and more importantly, people that I enjoy working with. So started taking projects back on, and in my network found there were a lot of other people that felt kind of the same way. People with very deep experience in in Latin America, in the energy sector in particular, but also mining, renewables, a couple other things that are kind of peripherally related. And we found that consistently there was a shortage of capital flowing into the region, and a lot of it was around fear. Like, people wanted to invest, but they didn't know how, or they were afraid of it because they didn't understand it. And you see, as time goes on, bad energy policy is driving a lack of investment. Good energy policy allows investment to start to flow, and you can create a virtuous cycle. If you get the right people involved and the right level of education involved and the engagement with the local communities, you can actually start creating virtuous cycles. So even small scale projects can have a really positive impact if they're done properly. So really what we're doing now is picking things where we feel like the gap in the opportunity is understanding. And whether that's understanding about the market, whether that's understanding about how to deal with communities and governments, or whether that's just a gap between really good project and good people that don't necessarily know how to communicate with an investment community, or vice versa, try to act as a bridge in that space.
Okay, super interesting. And what's the vision for the company that's in the next 5 years? Like, where'd you go from here?
So the problem with running, advisory companies or consulting companies is you always have you have either more projects than you have people, or more people than you have projects. So it's finding a balance between being able to provide attention and dedication to projects while having resources to pursue new opportunities. Because invariably, it always takes time to germinate a project, to actually develop it to the point where it becomes real. And in markets in Latin America, it often takes longer. Relationships take longer to build. There's more distrust.
Is that a cultural thing?
I think so, and I think it's also a frustration thing for North American and European investors that particularly seem to get confused in markets where they appear to be modern, but in fact the administration or the systems are still somewhat lagging, like Argentina, like
Hmm.
Mexico, where it's really nice experience to come. But the pace of decision making, the pace of regulatory controls is slower. So investors coming into the region and they get frustrated and they leave. And I lived in Argentina for 10 years and finally came to the realization that if you want to do business in Argentina, you need to come set up your shingle and wait 6 months. And if you're still there 6 months later, people will start to take you seriously. 6 months, you're really not going to get a lot of business done. So you just have to be patient. And that's kind of the upfront cost of getting into some of these markets. But what it's created locally is that a lot of Latin American businessmen and women, they don't trust that on the first meeting, everything's going to go great and all of a sudden we've got a business together. They really want to develop a relationship over a longer period of time. And how you bridge it is people like myself who spend most of their career in the region, speak the language, have family ties in the region. Those are ways to bridge the gap. But ultimately, a lot of it is about being able to speak the right language to the right audience and bridge between government, opportunity, capital, and make sure the three and community, so the four pillars, are really able to speak to one another about what the objectives are, how they're going to be achieved, what the risks are, how they're going to be mitigated, and make something that's actually understandable for everybody. And what we're finding is, as people understand, it's easier to get the projects done because you can find, you run into a problem and it doesn't become existential risk. It's just another problem. We can get over it together. So what we see going forward is taking on more and more projects has allowed us to build up a bit of a back office and bench where people that, the hard work of analyzing the situation can be done offline. And then what we're doing consistently now is we're finding that there's a need to implant people as well into the projects, at least for a period of time. So a lot of what we're doing is we're having project leads go in and be implanted in a company as either as a CEO, a CFO, a COO, filling a gap that the company maybe lacks, and helping to bridge between a local standard of doing business and a now global standard of doing business. Because really, the projects in Latin America in the energy sector require access to global capital. The size, the scope needs global capital, but global capital is only willing to invest if the standards are met, if the communication, even a lot of it's just information flow and communication. If that meets an international standard, it becomes more palatable to invest. So as we grow as a company, a broader base of contracts allows us to build a bench and maintain the bench, and ceases to have that be a big load on the advisory services itself, and a broader base of professionals like me that are kind of maybe in the last phase of their career, the last 15 years of their career, but still want to have value, maybe no longer work as much for salary and work more for the joy of the project or the challenge of the project, and be able to implant people into the projects as we go forward. And then ultimately what you start to get into, we've been doing this now for almost 2 years, you start to get into the virtuous cycle where you start to reap the benefits of the projects that you started 2 years ago that come to fruition. The financing has occurred, the profitability is starting to be occurred. And in many cases, we stay involved to continue to advise the companies or the boards of the companies if they become larger, or in other cases, we exit and then there's a payday, which allows us to kind of fund the next phase of growth.
A lot of parallels to my business and what you said in regards to, I always say we're either overstaffed or understaffed, right? There's no, yeah, there's never like there might be like 5 minutes at one point where
Yeah.
it's equilibrium. What have you learned in the first 2 years in the business? Like, how has your vision changed from what you wanted to start versus like the reality of what you need to do now? Has it changed, or is it all according to plan?
I think it's been difficult to plan given the very rapid change in the geopolitical system globally,
Oh yeah,
and
I read about
the
that.
ex- the expectations and the concerns that investors have is just changing so quickly
Day to
that,
day, I guess, in some cases.
yeah, I mean, we have, like, in Latin American context, we had 27 years where Venezuela was uninvestable, and then all of a sudden something changes and all of a sudden you have 50 inbound calls about how do you do business in Venezuela. Now, we're not ready to do business there yet globally, but that opportunity suddenly comes back on the table very, very abruptly. And we've seen a huge swing in the appetite of investors for conventional oil and gas investments,
Yeah.
and let's call it dirtier mining investments, more conventional and industrial mining, coal and the like, which was kind of completely off the table under the previous administration in the US, has suddenly come back for US investors. So what you're seeing is projects having to be able to shift and adapt and look for the right audience. I think there's a bit of a power vacuum in Latin America as well, where you had a period of 6 or 7 years the second half of the first Trump administration and certainly the Biden administration, where U.S. capital became extremely interior focused into the U.S.
Mhm.
and lack of U.S. capital flowing into Latin America, and really the incompetence of the Canadian government at the time to do anything to kind of backfill and say the Toronto market could have been a logical source of capital for Latin American projects if the Toronto market was actually functional at the time and, the government was backing international investment. Didn't happen. So the power vacuum exists, and what you've seen is an increased flow of Chinese, Russian, and Middle Eastern sovereign wealth coming into Latin America. So a lot of infrastructure that's gone forward in the last 10 years has been funded by non-conventional sources. So now will take an example like Peru. You have a massive port in Chancay that's built by the Chinese. There's a whole industry around that port, from transport to suppliers to industrial workers that want to work in the port, power suppliers, everything that's kind of integrated in around that port. But because that port is Chinese owned, it's almost uninvestable for American investors. So, helping people fit into a changing landscape where you had 100 years basically of the majority of the capital for development in Latin America coming from North America, and then maybe Spain and England also participating actively in Latin America. To all of a sudden, it's much more of a global landscape, but there's a real gap of U.S. investment. And, as a perfect case in point, Latino businessmen are not used to dealing with significant time zone differences with their bankers. And it's a stupid small point, but all of a sudden you're like, well, we're talking to a banker in Hong Kong or Singapore. That's 12-hour time difference. Like,
Yeah.
I don't care that you don't get up till 10 o'clock in the morning. You have to get up early for the call,
Yeah.
which sounds, very petty. But at the end of the day, even those types of things where you have somebody in the middle that can speak the language, that understands the cultural sensitivities and can help to bridge the gap is what's facilitating companies be able to go out and tap international sources of capital.
Yeah. Small details like that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Time zones we have clients in Singapore, for instance. That's the worst one for us. It's a good, I think it's 12 hours actually, like you said. Definitely a
Well,
learning
and what
curve
we're
there.
finding, like, we've had investors recently in from the U.S. into Mexico, and taking them in to see senior government officials, for example, and you're like, the meeting will be late. Like, just understand this isn't New York. They're not going to apologize when they come in 10, 15 minutes late. It's culturally normal that a person in power is going to keep you waiting. In Mexico, they're quite respectful and they keep it to a minimum, right? It's not like other countries where you might be waiting for 2 hours, but just prepping people to say, don't get upset. It's normal. It's expected. Um, you can avoid an opportunity being lost just because people don't understand the simple nuances.
Absolutely. Yeah. Someone takes it the wrong way. And that was a scene in the movie, the Martin Scorsese movie. I forgot the name, but Irishman, right? 15
Yeah.
minutes, now 10 minutes. Um, what's your day to day like?
So I actively lead a couple of projects for the company. So I'm leading an oil and gas project in Central Africa, a geothermal project in Argentina, and a natural gas project here as the kind of technical lead. So I have my day kind of gets spaced out because of time zones. Early morning, I deal with Africa, and then I kind of shift into Argentina and then finish the day with Mexico because that seems to be how it flows. But a lot of what I'm doing personally is much more on the energy policy side of things. So we're doing a fair bit of research into how energy policy drives immigration, how good energy policy can create opportunities in under-recognized markets, looking at development in southern Mexico in particular, in northern Central America, as a more effective mechanism, development capital being a more effective mechanism for stalling immigration than barriers and policing and the things that are being used heavily today. Um, we're finding that there is a interesting bipartisan support in the U.S. and bipartisan or tripartisan support in Mexico for this message. Everybody gets it when you start to explain it and say that this isn't just about building a power line or a gas pipeline, and it's not about just about the intrinsic value of the project. There's also a benefit of keeping highly skilled personnel and workers close to home and allowing people to not have to move. And the message that I found resonates in a lot of ways. I'm an immigrant. I'm Canadian, and I left Canada to find a better quality of life for myself and my family. happened to work as an oil field executive, but so obviously I'm not doing it out of the desperation to eat, but the same impulse exists. The same idea of you move because there's a better opportunity for you personally or for your family. Um, and we're finding that by slowly and repetitively saying the same thing over and over and over again and highlighting some cases where this is starting to have real positive benefit, politicians are starting to get it, especially at the local level. It's very easy to sell at the local level because there's an immediate, tangible
Yeah.
development benefit.
Yeah. They see it.
But when you get to the state level as well, in a lot of states, there's a real understanding that this needs to happen. And then when you go to a federal level, you see people lights going off on people's heads, right? Like you don't measure this just on, you don't measure project success just on the number of tax dollars paid or the number of jobs created. Those are very important statistics, but you add in social impact, you add in, people being able to raise the median income in an underprivileged area
Yeah.
has a trickle-on effect in the economy. More production closer to home is a trickle-on effect in the economy. And I started working on this 6 or 7 years ago on natural gas, with 80% of Mexico's natural gas being imported from the US. When you actually look at it, every dollar that's spent on natural gas in Mexico, 5 cents stays in Mexico and 95 cents goes to the US. Whereas if you're producing the gas in Mexico, about 90 cents stay in Mexico. Even though there'd be international service companies and people involved and some money will leave, the majority of the benefit stays in the country. So, domestic production numbers are not just about we want to nationalize and be energy independent. It's also about the real economic value. Measuring projects, the other thing that we've been working on a lot with very, very smart people is instead of just looking at emissions and looking at deforestation numbers and reforestation numbers, using biodiversity as a primary indicator of the health of the region. So when you have large regional development projects like power lines, like pipelines, big ports, it's very difficult to get real science behind what the impact is. But what does apply is, if there were 150 Jaguars in the region 6 years ago and there's 300 now, the project is not having a net negative impact. If there's no Jaguars left, no matter how much you've done on emissions and no matter how much you've done on reforestation, the project's having a net negative impact. For me, learning this from very bright people in Mexico and then applying it around the region has been a way to also remove a lot of the friction in discussing impacts of projects, because you have a measuring stick that's long enough and objective enough that, first of all, it's difficult to manipulate. And second of all, the community has to be engaged in it. Like, how do you monitor biodiversity in a biological reserve? You need the local communities to be involved, which in some ways creates employment. It also creates a need for them to be educated about the project. And if you're educated about something, it's a lot harder to throw mud at it, right? It's easy to yell and scream about something you don't understand, but
You
when you
don't
actually
understand.
understand the details, it's a lot harder. So a lot of it has been around kind of raising the bar and also looking out longer into the horizon when we talk about development. Nobody wants a power plant built next door. Nobody. Nobody wants a pipeline to go through their backyard, right? Everywhere in the world, everybody feels the same
They
way.
need it and they want it, but not in their backyard.
They
Right?
want the jobs, they want the
Yeah.
economic benefit, but they don't want the direct impact. But if you can, and there's some wonderful places that this has been done. Like Norway and Canada lead the world in terms of how you make sure that there are biological overpasses over infrastructure that are functional, right?
Yeah.
Let's not invent the wheel. Let's see places where this works, right? You have cases of, ports that have massive mangrove recovery projects associated with them. And then the net environment around the port, as long as you go out a little bit from the edge, is positive, right? Lots of things can be done as long as you get people thinking about it long term. And now the challenge becomes, if you have investors that only care about quarterly returns and politicians that maximum care about 2 to 4 year terms, you got to do a lot of talking and convincing to get people to think 10 years and 20 years out.
Yeah.
Um,
Is that even
but
possible in the current state of things?
it is, as long as you understand that it's logical that people have short-term interests and that
Mhm.
sometimes there needs to be short-term benefit.
So you have to kind of twist the message to put the emphasis on the short term, although it's a long term play.
The way I view it is like, if you're going into a new area and you're going to build a plant, whatever type, right? Your long-term objective may be biodiversity, health of the ecosystem, animals, plants, whatever, reforestation, biodiversity corridors, all those types of things. But you may have to repaint the school and buy some computers in the short term
Right.
to get the communities to open their ears to listen to the long term.
The buy-in. Yeah.
Yeah. As long as that is part of it, the stupid way to do it is I'm going to repaint your school and gift you some computers. The smart way to do it is I'm going to make the school a place kids want to go. And we're going to provide them the education that allows them to go back and teach their parents about why this matters because they care. They want the forest to still be healthy 30 years from now because they're still going to be here. So you start at the kids. We had a wonderful group of people in a previous company that came up with the idea to do a reforestation project, but only allow the children from the community to do the reforestation. So no adults. We went in and we taught the kids how to do it safely, explained why we were doing it, explained why we were using, I say we, I was, all I did was sign the check. It was brilliant people working with me that plant. But we spent a day with the kids and they learned about why we were planting certain species of trees because they were from that area and they had all of these extra benefits. We worked with them later on to do bee cultivation projects and in these reforested areas, get some income from the honey. And then we looked at shade-grown coffee in the same area. So the reforested area now has economic value for the community and they want to protect it. And then all of a sudden the communities are out there offering to help us with the biodiversity monitoring because they've got people out there anyway. So of course they're happy to check the photo traps for us and provide the information that the scientists need to do their work. But it takes a long time and takes patience. And it only works if you conceive of these things as being necessary for the long-term success of the project from day one. And a lot of what we do is filtering on our projects, both from the investor side of things and from the project side of things, or even if we're working with a municipal or state government, are people motivated for creating long-term benefit? If they are, as long as they're interested and want to do it, everything else can be learned. They don't need to be experts on anything. If somebody is only interested, I need this because I need to get reelected next year, or I don't really, all of that stuff is just cost. I only want to talk about the profitability of my manufacturing line or my processing plant. We just don't work with those projects because ultimately we think they're doomed to fail either in the short or long term.
Is it hard to staff, this type of, because obviously you need kind of a dual expertise almost. You need like someone, that understands and is an expert in maybe international standards, but also probably can interact with the local market, right? Like, is it hard to find consultants for your group? And what's the biggest challenge for you, like that you see?
I think a lot of people in the oil and gas industry have gone through the same emotional process I have over the last 25 or 30 years, where, it used to be at the beginning of my career, people in the oil industry were quite proud of what they did. And then all of a sudden, I've said a lot about, we became the bad guy in the movies. Right?
Yeah,
it was no longer acceptable to say bad things about the Russians or the Chinese. So all of a sudden the evil villains in all the spy movies are the oil and gas guys. Right. And we almost became as an industry apologetic. I'm really sorry we have to do this. I'm really sorry we have to go and drill a well or run a pipeline or whatever. And then as we started to think about it and said, well, minor natural disasters, earthquakes or big ones. I was close to the tsunami in Indonesia. I lived in Malaysia at the time, was actually on a beach that thankfully was protected when it occurred.
Oh, wow.
And, was actively involved in rescue efforts and recovery efforts. And I'm looking around, it's all diesel generators and all the boats that are flying around are running diesel or gasoline. And there's no batteries anywhere to be seen because there's no power lines. All the power lines are gone. Earthquakes in Mexico and in Acapulco, the power was out for 4 or 5 weeks in a lot of areas. So, realizing that we facilitate things that are very difficult to replace in any way, shape or form. And at the end of the day, we have an obligation to do it more responsibly and be as clean as possible. But at the end, the modern world and the quality of life we all benefit from is driven by the oil and gas sector.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden you said, we have to be proud of what we're able to achieve. And the other part of this puzzle that came together for me is I lived in Colombia and had the extraordinary opportunity to be fairly close to the peace process. It was actually in the ceremony when the peace agreement was signed, which was a wonderful experience. And we realized that the only companies that were willing to go and work in the areas that had been controlled by the guerrillas were the oil and gas and the mining sector, because we were accustomed to going to remote places and working in difficult environments. We were accustomed with having to engage with security risk, community challenges, remote logistics. And as a result, the first phase of development that started to occur was oil and gas and mining. And we should be proud of that. We should be a tool in the arsenal of any government to be able to achieve better quality of living, with investments in renewables, with investments in reliability, with investments in reduction in emissions and losses and the like. But we should be proud of what we can achieve. And then all of a sudden started to realize that there were ways, again, working with very smart people, there were ways to do things in an environmentally friendly fashion that could actually make the environment better than when we got there. And there's tons of examples around the world where this has been done and done successfully. It's hard work, but what it did is it motivated me to go out and start to try to do some of this stuff. And then I realized there were a lot of other people that felt like me as well, that they were, they had a successful career. They've worked maybe in 10 or 15 different countries, because that's one thing the oil industry does well, is move people around and
Yeah.
globalize the experience base. And they were looking to do something where the impact could be more beneficial, where it could be more long-term and sustainable. And as I think most people do, as they get to a certain stage in their life, you start to think about what you're leaving behind, right, at the end of your career. So it's actually been easier than I thought to find good people to do this. And as we've grown a little bit, started out with really me and a couple other guys, and now we've got, a group of 40 or 50 people we can call on, depending on the project, to lead things or to run things. And it's been a lot of fun.
Oh, wow. Okay. So mostly through your network and just a lot of like-minded people.
Yep. You add young people with good energy and interesting ideas that are willing to challenge you, and some old people that have a lot of experience. As
Good
long as
mix.
both are open to listening to one another, you can create a great mix.
What's your relationship with AI at the company?
So I'm on the board of an AI company that's using AI for optimization in the oil industry. So I've been exposed through that, which has been really interesting. Two brilliant university professors from the UK with 20 years of experience in the oil industry, but PhDs in incredibly exotic mathematical theory. So it's been fun to see how questions that couldn't be answered before are now starting to be able to be answered in real time, whereas before it would be like a month of engineers working. Now you can answer in 20 minutes.
Yeah.
That evolution's really interesting, and it's allowed us to play with data in a way, and play with understanding in a way we never have thought before, and ultimately optimize the industry. Because if you think about it, if you can make the industry 5% more efficient, the impact that has in the global
Yeah.
economy is massive. Right?
Tremendous. Yeah.
And then what we're doing is a lot of early stage data gathering, and allows especially younger people to play with ideas and calibrate ideas. We're finding that we have to data bound it, and we have to physics bound it. That it's the existing commercially available models, if you're not really smart about how you input the information and limit the processing, the data you get out is dangerous. And that's one of the challenges in the sector, where mistakes can cause massive accidents and causes, explosions and deaths. You have to be
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
careful about relying on the models. But we are finding that by building data-bound systems, it works very, very effectively for the early stage idea generation. Really effective. And then it works really well when you have a highly elaborate use of the technology, but with really smart physics bounds on it and physics controls on it. The middle is a little bit dangerous still. But we are seeing an increased uptake in it. We're seeing massive increase in output from things like our legal processes, because we're able to do comparisons much faster, evolve documents much faster. Even simple things like ensuring consistency. A closing package on a financing deal might be 50 or 60 documents, right? For someone manually to make sure there's no holes or no missed references or no definitions that are different in all those documents, which can then create problems with lawsuits later on, is incredibly cumbersome. But by having AI involved, you can do it much more quickly.
Yeah. So document comparison, essentially.
Yeah, and document generation, first drafts, and I want to take this and modify it for this
Yeah.
purpose. That kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Getting the first draft quickly is much more effective, for sure.
Absolutely. I mean, I had a, obviously not on that scale, but I had a case a couple weeks back where I needed a lawyer letter, and essentially, used I think it was ChatGPT at the time to create a first draft, sent it to my lawyer, and it basically said, "Yeah, this is great." No notes, right? And it's
Yeah.
saved a couple billable hours for sure just with that interaction. But yeah, it makes everything go faster for sure. Um, Final question for you, Aaron, today. What innovation are you most excited about? Maybe in oil and gas, or maybe something more directly linked to your day-to-day activities at the advisory firm?
So I think there's two things. I think the use of AI for um, opening the bounds of what questions can be asked and what can be accurately analyzed. And I think the creativity that can come out of that is very exciting. Like as an example today, there is no way for a board to ask if gas goes to $3, what is our optimal way to produce an oil field, right? It doesn't that
Hmm.
the engineering work required in the middle is literally weeks of engineering work to get that answer today. AI is getting close to be able to get you an answer that's going to allow you to play with scenarios much more effectively, and come up with solutions that maybe you didn't even expect. Because like the example you gave of generating a document that you knew basically what you wanted,
Yeah.
it's really good for that. But it's really exciting when it proposes something you hadn't thought about, right? When you ask the right question, what else should I be asking here? What am I not thinking about? What else should be in this legal document that I haven't thought about? Oh, I hadn't thought about that, right? That kind of stuff can really accelerate the pace of effectiveness for an individual employee. That's one side of it. The other thing I'm very excited about is there's a lot of work going on in real world science to measure emissions. The reality is most of what we do on emissions is we come up with theoretical leakage numbers and we figure out roughly how much CO2 is produced because the rough chemistry says that if you burn this much oil, this much CO2
Mm.
is released. It's a decent first step, but with some of the satellite imagery that's going on, some of the drone technology that's being developed that allows you to actually measure emissions, I'm really excited about the impact that can have because it allows you to actually fix the problems much more quickly. And I think we're starting to realize as an industry, real emissions, forgetting about objectives and statistics, real emissions are a lot of it is about the boring engineering work of fixing problems and replacing things that aren't modern with more modern things that are better served. And that whole mindset is now starting to be adapted in the renewable sector as well, where we look at whole life cycle impact of projects, not just a sound bite that the public likes. And I'm really pleased to see that we're starting to have conversations about what's the full cycle impact of a windmill that works 6 hours a day versus a hydroelectric plant that maybe destroys a valley versus an oil and gas that has air emissions, right? And they all have impacts, but let's talk about the real impact and pick the one that we think that is the most amenable to a long-term healthy environment. So those are the two things I'm most excited about.
So basically, getting more accurate data across the board and quicker access to decision making.
Yeah, get rid of the rhetoric and the people throwing stones and start to talk about, okay, this is a 6, this is a 4. How do we get the 6 down to a 4 and the 4
Right.
down to a 3? Right. Real world. I mean, I guess that's the engineer in me that's is biased towards wanting to have real engineering solutions.
No, but that's the right way to do it, I think.
Yeah.
Warren, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Phil. It was great to talk.